We could not believe it. The enemy gave us warm water. The words scratched in uneven German into the corner of a diary page belonged not to a free man, but to a prisoner, one of thousands marched behind barbed wire to Camp Atterbury, Indiana, in 1945. He had braced himself for cruelty, for filth, for the long humiliation of captivity. Instead, he was handed soap, led into a tiled room, shoved beneath pipes that hissed to life. And then, the shock. Hot water pouring over skin that had not felt it in months. Steam curling like ghostly banners in the air. Soldiers of Hitler, men hardened by battle, by propaganda, by the collapse of their empire, stood trembling, laughing, even weeping beneath the spray. The guards watched from the walls, rifles slung loosely at their sides, their faces caught between unease and wonder. One remembered it decades later. I had expected hate-defiant silence. What I saw instead were boys, just boys. They looked as if they had been returned to life by water. It was not the battlefield that broke them that day, not artillery, not hunger, not chains. It was mercy so simple, so ordinary, that it struck harder than any weapon. The showers at Camp Atterbury became a moment whispered about in reports, remembered in fragments, told again and again, until it blurred into something larger than fact. Was it kindness or control? Was it America's abundance on display, or America's discipline disguised as generosity? The answer, perhaps, is both. What matters is the scene itself, prisoners frozen at the threshold, steam rolling over their shoulders, the hiss of pipes drowning out the silence of defeat. The moment when men expected degradation and instead received dignity. A contradiction so stark, it unsettled them more than capture itself. This is where our story begins, not in the thunder of guns, but in the hush of water striking tile. Not with surrender on a battlefield, but with the surrender of certainty inside a wooden barrack in Indiana. The war was ending. But for those who stepped beneath those showers, another kind of war had just begun. A war within a struggle to reconcile enemy with benefactor, hatred with gratitude, defeat with humanity. And it leaves us with a question that lingers in the steam. What does it mean in the darkest of wars, when mercy cuts deeper than violence? Indiana in 1945 was far from the shattered ruins of Europe. Yet war pulsed quietly within its fences. Camp Atterbury stood like a small city. In itself, a sprawl of wooden barracks, watchtowers, training fields. And now behind lines of barbed wire, a population of men who had once marched under the swastika. Built originally as a training base for American divisions, the camp transformed into a holding ground for prisoners as the tide of war turned. By 1943, with Allied victories in North Africa and Italy, thousands of German and Italian soldiers were shipped across the ocean and scattered across the American Midwest, far from any battlefield, far from any chance of return. For the Americans who lived nearby, the camp was both a curiosity and a symbol. Farmers hauling corn and wheat along rural roads saw trucks of prisoners under guard, their uniforms stripped of insignia, their faces blank and unreadable. Children dared one another to ride bicycles near the barbed wire to glimpse the enemy through the fences, only to see men no different from their own fathers and brothers, just younger or older, thinner or dirtier. Local newspapers printed cautious stories about the camp's efficiency, about how prisoners worked the fields, about how America, unlike its enemies, treated captives with fairness. Behind those lines, the government understood it was not enough to simply confine men, they had to be managed. Life at Atterbury fell into patterns of routine. At dawn came roll call rows of men shivering in the Midwestern chill, lined up under the watchful eyes of guards. Breakfast was basic, but filling bread porridge, sometimes meat. Then came labor. Some prisoners worked on farms outside the wire, filling the labor gaps left by American men at the front. Others cut timber, built roads, cleaned the camp itself. Hours passed in sweat and silence, with occasional bursts of song drifting from groups of men who clung to memory through music. By evening, the prisoners returned, ate again, smoked if they had cigarettes, spoke softly in German under the dim light of the barracks. The barracks themselves were cramped, but not squalid rows of bunks, thin blanket stoves that sometimes failed to keep out the bitter Indiana winter. The men hung bits of clothing, photographs, or crude carvings along the walls, making their corner of captivity bearable. But dirt was constant. Mud caked their boots, lice crawled through seams, sweat and labor left them reeking. For men accustomed to military order, the inability to keep themselves clean was an indignity sharper than hunger. They washed in basins with cold water when they could, but the filth clung a reminder that captivity eroded not just freedom, but dignity. This was the world into which the showers entered. To Americans, they were standard military facilities, rows of pipes, tiled walls, part of the camp's sanitary infrastructure. To the prisoners, they were astonishing. In wartime Germany, even civilians often lacked soap, let alone running hot water. Bombed-out cities left families boiling rainwater in dented pots, rationing soap like treasure. Soldiers at the front washed in rivers, in puddles, in nothing at all. And here, in the heartland of the enemy prisoners, were marched into a room where hot water poured in endless streams, steam rising as though war itself had evaporated. Atterbury's command followed orders set by the War Department. The Geneva Convention was the baseline, but America went further. Cleanliness was not just health, it was control. Lice-free men were less rebellious. Orderly routines kept them occupied, made them predictable. And more than that, every hot shower, every clean towel, every decent meal became a subtle weapon proof that America's system could afford humanity, even for its enemies. It was discipline disguised as generosity propaganda, built into plumbing. Yet none of this was apparent to the men stepping under the spray for the first time. For them, it was disbelief. Laughter, sometimes tears. A moment when the walls of ideology cracked, and they glimpsed a world that confounded everything they had been told. Camp Atterbury's showers became more than hygiene. They became a story whispered in barracks, carried home after the war, retold to children who could not imagine such a thing. Thus the context, a Midwestern camp that held the war within its fences, a system built on discipline and policy. And a moment when something as ordinary as water became extraordinary. It is here in this strange collision of control and kindness that our story unfolds. The paper trail that survives is thin but sharp. Scattered columns in Indiana newspapers, official inspection reports, filed away in Washington letters, tucked into attics, fragments of testimony recorded decades later. Together, they weave the factual backbone of what happened at Camp Atterbury in 1945, when German prisoners of war discovered showers that shocked them more than barbed wire ever could. The Indianapolis Star ran a brief item that spring. No headline splashed across the front page, just a column buried deep inside. Enemy prisoners at Atterbury expressed astonishment at sanitary arrangements provided by the camp, including modern shower facilities. Guards report, some men laughed, others wept. The words were spare factual, almost clinical, but their presence in print gave the event a kind of official weight. Local readers sipping coffee in kitchens likely shook their heads in disbelief. The idea that America's enemies were washed and cared for while their own sons fought in Europe seemed at once a point of pride and a cause for grumbling. International Red Cross inspection reports tell the same story in the dry cadences of bureaucracy. Inspectors toured the camp, noted the quality of food, the discipline of guards, the orderliness of barracks. In their 1945 file, they added a line that would resonate later. Sanitary facilities, including hot water showers, provided regularly. Prisoners appeared surprised, but satisfied. Behind that neutral phrasing lay something human. Something unscripted astonishment made visible in the men's reactions, recorded in ink by officials who likely never forgot the scene. Letters from American guards speak in warmer tones. One corporal, writing home to his wife in Bloomington, confessed, "I don't know how to explain it." These were tough men when they arrived, hard faces, eyes like stone. But when they got under that water, you should have seen them. They laughed like kids. They splashed each other. Some just stood there with their eyes shut, grinning. It made me forget for a moment that they were the enemy. Another wrote more cautiously. It almost felt wrong seeing them so grateful. My brother is still in France, living on rations and mud. And here we are giving the Krauts warm baths. The tension was there between duty empathy and resentment. From the German side, fragments come through in memoirs and oral histories. A Wehrmacht sergeant interviewed decades later described Atterbury as a strange paradise. He recalled that the men whispered to each other in disbelief. Even here in defeat, we are given more than our families at home. Another prisoner remembered the showers as the first time I felt like a human being again since capture. We had been treated like animals, marching in mud, sleeping in barns. The Americans put us under hot water. It confused me more than their weapons ever did. Archival photographs add to the evidence. Grainy black and white images showing POWs in plain uniforms lined up outside low wooden buildings. Towels draped over their shoulders, guards with rifles leaning against door frames. The photos are uncaptioned, but context marks them as Atterbury. They freeze the mundane and silver-grain prisoners waiting for something so ordinary, yet in that context, extraordinary. These documents, the clipped newspaper, the Red Cross report, the letters, the testimonies, the photographs, do not tell the whole story. But they pin it down in time and place. They prove that the astonishment was real, that the showers were not legend or exaggeration, but fact. At Camp Atterbury, 1945, German prisoners of war were stunned not by cruelty, but by cleanliness. And that paradox was so unusual it demanded to be written, remembered, and preserved. Facts pin the story to paper. But it is the whispers, the retellings, the embroidered fragments of memory that give it life beyond reports. At Camp Atterbury, the showers became more than a facility. They became a legend, whispered in barracks, retold in farmhouses, carried across oceans to villages in Bavaria and Saxony. Among the POWs themselves, folklore grew almost overnight. New arrivals were told by older prisoners, half in jest and half in awe. Wait until they march you to the showers. You will not believe it. Some claimed the water never ran cold, that it poured endlessly like a river summoned from the walls. Others swore the pipes were enchanted by America's wealth, that no German town could match such abundance even before the war. There were darker versions too. Rumors whispered in the corner bunks that the hot water was a trick, that it would suddenly scald or be laced with chemicals. But each man who stepped out steaming and grinning disproved the fear until disbelief turned into ritual anticipation. Years later, when they had returned to a bombed and starving Germany, former prisoners told their families of those showers as if describing another world. Children huddled around kitchen tables in ruined houses listened wide-eyed as fathers recalled how the enemy gave us hot water as if we were their guests. Wives, scraping together rations, could scarcely imagine such a thing. In these retellings, the showers took on a glow of myth, part shame, part wonder. Some men spoke with gratitude, others with bitterness, but all admitted they had never forgotten it. The guards carried their own stories into folklore. In bars years after the war, over beers with fellow veterans, they told of the day the Germans stood like statues at the threshold, unable to step forward, and then broke into laughter that echoed down the tiled walls. Some claimed hardened SS officers wept openly under the spray. One insisted that a prisoner began to sing in German, and soon the showers were filled with voices rising through the steam like a strange cathedral hymn. Whether true or not, the stories spread, polished by retelling, always ending with a shake of the head. You had to see it to believe it. Even the locals spun their own versions. Farmers who worked alongside POWs in the fields said the men spoke of little else after that first bath. Children in nearby towns grew up hearing from their parents that the enemy lived better in Atterbury than we did in our own homes. Some stories painted the showers as proof of American generosity. Others turned it into a cautionary tale, whispered with resentment. Why should captives bathe in hot water while sons at the front fought in mud? And then there are the stranger tales rumors with no document to anchor them. That prisoners carved their names into the wooden benches outside the wash house. That a guard once tossed in a bar of soap as a joke, only to be thanked as if he had given gold. That after one shower session, a group of prisoners knelt together and prayed in silence, steam still rising from their skin. True or not, these stories persisted, passed from one mouth to another, accumulating the patina of legend. In the end, folklore blurred the line between fact and imagination. The showers became not just pipes and water, but a symbol, a mythic moment when war's certainties dissolved. In the steam of Atterbury, enemies were stripped of armor, stripped of ideology, left only as men astonished by warmth. And it is that image, factual or embroidered, that lingers like mist long after the camp itself vanished from the Indiana plains. Beneath the steam and the astonished laughter of the prisoners was a structure, a carefully built system, designed in Washington, executed by officers and guards, monitored by inspectors, and endless paperwork. Nothing at Camp Atterbury happened by chance. Even the showers that so bewildered the German POWs were part of a mechanism, both rigid and calculated, a mechanism that combined international law, practical necessity, and psychological strategy. The legal foundation was the 1929 Geneva Convention, which required humane treatment for prisoners housing food sanitation. The United States followed not only because of international obligation, but because it served a political purpose. Humane treatment of POWs became proof to display against Axis brutality. Local journalists were invited into the camps. International Red Cross inspectors allowed to roam freely. When reports returned to Geneva describing modern shower facilities, they were not simply notes on plumbing. They were exhibits of moral superiority, evidence that democracy could extend dignity even to its enemies. Yet behind this, humanity lay practical calculation. Camps like Atterbury held thousands of men. A mass of unwashed, restless prisoners meant disease, unrest, and potential rebellion. Cleanliness was control. Hygiene was order. A man who could scrub away lice was less likely to fall sick, less likely to brawl with comrades, less likely to defy his captors. From the Army's perspective, a hot shower was not just kindness, it was a security measure, as effective in its own way as barbed wire and watchtowers. But there was a subtler layer: re-education through experience. American planners knew lectures or pamphlets would not easily erode years of Nazi propaganda. Instead, they relied on exposure. They wanted German prisoners to see America, to feel its abundance in their bodies. To eat decent meals, to sleep in heated barracks, to work in orderly routines, and yes, to step into showers where hot water flowed endlessly. In Germany, civilians rationed soap like treasure children washed in basins of cold rainwater. In America, even captives were bathed in warmth. The contrast was deliberate, disorienting, and powerful. Economics reinforced the system. With millions of American men, overseas farms and factories struggled for labor. POWs filled the gaps, picking corn, cutting timber, digging ditches. To keep them productive, they had to be kept healthy. Soap and hot water became tools of labor management, ensuring that America's war machine did not stall on the home front. And there was one more layer: self-image. To the Americans themselves, guards, officers, civilians peering through fences, the showers symbolized who they were. They told themselves, we are not like them. We do not starve our prisoners. We do not beat them into submission. We give them food, heat, even hot baths. In that mirror, America saw its strength reflected not only in guns, but in discipline disguised as compassion. Still, the system was not sentiment. It was structure. The hot water at Camp Atterbury was not meant to make prisoners happy. It was meant to keep them contained, healthy, useful, and impressed by the superiority of their captor's world. It was an act of mercy, yes, but also an act of control. That paradox is what makes the story so unsettling, that a stream of hot water could be both a human gift and a calculated weapon in the quiet machinery of war. It was late winter in Indiana, the kind of day when the sky pressed low and gray and the cold seemed to seep into bone. A line of German prisoners shuffled across the yard toward the low wooden structure that housed the camp's shower block. Their boots were caked with mud, their uniforms stiff and sour with weeks of wear. They expected another inspection, another roll call, perhaps even a punishment detail. What awaited them instead was something they had long forgotten could exist. The guards opened the doors, and steam spilled into the frosted air. The prisoners stopped startled, as if confronted by a vision. Inside, pipes rattled and hissed. Hot water cascaded in steady streams, pooling on tiled floors, filling the room with mist. The smell of soap hung in the air. For a moment, none of them moved. They stared, clutching their towels, eyes darting to one another in disbelief. Finally, one man stepped forward. He stripped quickly, almost angrily, as though daring the guards to laugh at him. He stepped beneath the spray. The water struck his shoulders hot, relentless. His eyes widened. A gasp tore from his throat. Then slowly he began to laugh. Not the harsh bark of a soldier, but a sound almost boyish, almost innocent. The others watched, and then, as though a dam had broken, they moved two boots, clattering belts falling, pale bodies crowding beneath the jets. What followed astonished even the Americans who watched from the doorway. Hardened men, veterans of Africa, of the Russian front, stood with their heads tilted back, mouths open, letting the water run over their faces, as if baptizing them into another life. Some closed their eyes and wept quietly, tears indistinguishable from the spray. Others slapped each other on the back, laughing with a kind of manic relief. Voices rose in German shouts, jokes, fragments of song that echoed strangely in the mist. One prisoner, gaunt and hollow-eyed, began to sing a hymn remembered from childhood. His voice was shaky but clear. Within moments, others joined their tones, blending into a rough but powerful chorus. The sound filled the tiled room, resonant, haunting. A hymn of defeated soldiers transformed into a choir beneath foreign showers. Even the guards fell silent, rifles slack in their hands. One would later admit it was the strangest moment of the war. I didn't see Nazis. I didn't see enemies. I saw men, just men, grateful for hot water. In the far corner, an officer who had refused at first arms, crossed jaw-tight eyes, full of suspicion, finally stepped forward. He undressed slowly, his movements stiff with pride. But when the water struck him, his rigid posture broke. He pressed his palms to the wall, lowered his head, and whispered words in German that sounded like a prayer. No one laughed. The steam wrapped around him, softening his defiance, until it seemed to dissolve entirely. The climax was not a battle, not a riot, not an escape. It was a room of enemies, stripped of weapons of rank, of ideology, reduced to something universal. The hiss of water, the roar of voices, the silence of men caught between humiliation and gratitude. When the valves finally shut and the water ceased, the prisoners stood dripping, stunned, as though reluctant to leave. Some whispered that they felt cleaner than they had in years, not just on their skin, but in their souls. It was a victory measured not in territory or prisoners taken, but in something intangible, the surrender of certainty, the breaking of an image. For those few minutes inside a steaming barrack in Indiana, war itself seemed to pause. When the pipes fell silent and the steam thinned into the cold Indiana air, the prisoners returned to their barracks. But the moment followed them like a ghost. They wrapped themselves in clean towels, pulled on fresh-issued uniforms, and sat on their bunks, whispering, replaying the experience over and over. Some laughed nervously, still astonished that such a thing had been real. Others stared at the floor, silent, unsettled by the contradiction. They had been told America was cruel, that defeat would mean degradation. Instead, they had been given hot water soap and the strange gift of dignity. Letters smuggled home carried fragments of the memory. One prisoner wrote to his wife in Saxony, "I do not know how to tell you this. Our captors gave us showers with warm water." I felt human again. I am ashamed that here, as a prisoner, I am cleaner and warmer than you are in our ruined city. Another man, years later, recalled telling his children, "We were fed and bathed by the enemy. Imagine it. At home your grandmother boiled rainwater to wash you. But in Indiana, I stood under endless hot water." The story became a parable of contrast, repeated with wonder, bitterness, or disbelief, depending on who told it. For the American Guards, the memory lingered in a different way. Hardened by training conditioned to see the Germans as the enemy, they could not shake the images of those men laughing like boys, or the sight of officers broken by steam. Some admitted it made them uncomfortable. How could they reconcile pity with hatred? One corporal confessed years later, "I never forgot their faces. It felt like I saw the war peel off them for a moment, like dirt washed from skin." Local townspeople carried their own versions of the tale. Rumors spread quickly beyond the wire that the Germans were given showers more luxurious than what many farm families had at home. For some, it was proof of America's decency, a sign that the nation remained true to its values, even in war. For others, it was a source of resentment. In kitchens and churches, people whispered, "Our boys fight in mud, while the Krauts bathe in steam." The story hardened into local lore, retold with pride or anger, but never forgotten. Over time, the showers at Atterbury became more than hygiene. They became memory symbol, even myth. Historians would later note them in footnotes and Red Cross reports. But among those who lived it, the recollection carried emotional weight that outlasted the war itself. To some Germans, it was the first crack in their image of the Reich's superiority. To some Americans, it was proof of their nation's moral strength. To the families who heard the stories decades later, it was a riddle. How could war hold such mercy in its grasp? The aftermath was not written in military orders or diplomatic treaties. It lived in memory, in the way a prisoner's eyes filled when he recalled the steam, or the way a guard paused when asked about Atterbury. It was intangible, unrecorded in the ledgers of war, but powerful in its persistence. And so when the camp finally emptied, when the fences came down and the barracks were dismantled, the story remained. It lingered in Indiana, in Germany, in whispered folklore. The showers stood as a paradox, both a tool of control and an act of kindness, both calculated policy and human mercy. The water dried, but the memory did not. Today, Camp Atterbury is quiet. The barracks have been torn down, the wire long rusted away, the watchtowers gone. Only wind crosses the flat Indiana fields, whispering where men once marched under guard. Yet the memory remains hovering like steam that never truly dissipated. It is a memory that does not fit easily into the narrative of war. We expect tales of brutality, of hunger, of barbed wire and despair. But here the defining story is water-hot, clean, unexpected. A contradiction that unsettled both prisoner and guard. A moment where mercy pierced deeper than punishment, where the enemy was disarmed not by rifles, but by dignity. What do we make of it now? Was it strategy discipline hidden in compassion? Was it America's self-image displayed through abundance, even to its foes? Or was it something older, more stubborn? Something no system could fully control, the instinct to remind another man of his humanity, even when war had tried to erase it. For the Germans who stepped into that tiled room, the memory lingered long after their release. For the Americans who watched it, became a story told with a shake of the head, always ending with the same refrain: You had to see it to believe it. And for us, decades later, it poses a question that still haunts. If in the darkest years of the 20th century, enemies could be stripped of ideology by nothing more than warm water, then what other walls in our own time might fall if we dared to offer mercy where none is expected? The showers of Camp Atterbury were not just plumbing. They were a revelation. And like all revelations, they leave us not with answers, but with questions. Questions that echo long after the water stopped flowing. You have just heard another file from the hidden archive of war. If you wish to continue uncovering the truths that prisoners, generals, and even nations themselves never fully confessed, subscribe now. Do not miss what comes next.